This is Zoe Baxter talking to Brian Baxter about his experience on aircraft carriers. Hi, Brian. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, Zoe. I'm happy to be here.
All right, I'm going to start with some questions.
Yeah.
So, can you tell me what growing up in Atlanta, Georgia was like?
Sure. Yeah, I had a good childhood. Lived in a small neighborhood in the suburbs of Atlanta, and neighborhood kids would ride bikes, play in a little plot of land next to us, which was like undeveloped building lots we thought was like a big woods. Play around in the woods, even walk to school. So I was so close to school, and at that time you could walk to school. So, that's kind of what we did.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, can you tell me how your relationship was with your parents when you were younger?
Sure, yeah. I've always had a good relationship with my parents. They were young when they had me, so I think they were kind of feeling out what to do, how to be good parents, and we ended up being more like good friends than, traditional parents we'd expect.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Can you tell me how you spent your free time when you were younger?
Sure, yeah, like I just said before, bikes was huge at that time. We didn't have video games and phones and all the technology that you have now. So we were outside a lot. We were on our bikes. I lived in a closed neighborhood, sort of a development, and we would ride our bikes all around the neighborhood. There were basketball courts, tennis courts. We had a clubhouse that we could go to. So it was pretty neat to have all that right around home. And a lot of kids lived in that neighborhood because there were a lot of young families there. So we did a lot of, riding bikes, playing football. We used to play this game. We couldn't really organize. We were just playing in between houses in whatever grass we could find, but we'd play, tackle the man with the ball. It's kind of like football, but it's a free-for-all. Whoever has the ball just tries to run and not get tackled. And eventually they get tackled and everybody just piles on. So just that kind of stuff, normal kid stuff.
So you spent a lot of time outside as a kid. Can you tell me what inspired you to go into the military?
Sure, yeah. So I wanted to be an engineer. I learned at an early age, at least I had some sort of experience with what a civil engineer was. And I decided, that was something that interested me, not necessarily civil engineering, but I used to like to take my toys apart and figure out how they worked and this kind of stuff. And so some sort of engineering career intrigued me. And so I had my sights kind of set on going to a technical school. And when I was in high school, this movie came out, which you've heard of, Top Gun. And I had always had an interest in airplanes because where I lived in Atlanta was very near Atlanta Airport, and we'd see airplanes coming and going all the time. And sometimes my parents, my dad especially, would take me over to the airport to watch them take off and land. And so I had this fascination with airplanes and engineering. And then Top Gun came out, and I was like, oh wow, I'd never considered that I might be able to fly the planes. And then I found out that a large percentage of pilots in the Navy were actually engineers by training. So everything kind of came together, and I thought, that's what I set my targets on.
Cool. Thank you for telling me about that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a little bit about the military and what your interest was about going into it. So can you tell me a little bit about what the application was for going into the military? How was that process?
Oh, the process? So when you're in high school, I think that the recruiters know that a certain percentage of kids are going to want to go into the military right out of high school. So they come around a couple times a year and give their pitches to career day. And we had them come in, and after I had considered going to school, what I found out was that my parents weren't going to be able to fund me going to college. So at that time, Georgia, this was in Atlanta, Georgia, and Georgia now has in place this something called the Hope Scholarship, which is based off of the lottery there in Georgia. So they fund student scholarships through the lottery, but I was a little bit too early for that. And we couldn't really afford to pay for me to go to college. So the recruiters were promoting the GI Bill at that time as a way for people who couldn't afford to go to college to get money to go to college and then to have this job after you get out. So that's how I got hooked up with the Navy. And so a couple Top Gun and wanting to go to a technical school to study engineering, trying to figure out a way to get that done, brought me to the Navy. So just to back up a second, pilots are officers. They're part of the officer corps. To get the GI Bill, before I was an officer, I'd have to get my college degree. So I enlisted. And so as an enlisted member, you're sort of a rank and file member of the military. So my plan was to go in as an enlisted sailor, get my training, get my money for school, get my degree, then apply for a commission, which is what they call it when you go into officer training. And so that was the course I was on. So I decided to apply to the Navy's program. And then there was a Navy base in Atlanta, Naval Air Station Atlanta. So I could go into the Navy, come back to Atlanta, and I would do my work, my drill. They called it drill when you would go on the weekends to the base. And it was all local, and I could go to school at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And so it all worked out well. You have to take a test called the ASVAB test, which is, I can't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but it's an aptitude test that kind of assesses your inherent abilities for certain job skills. So I took that test and I scored high enough to get into aviation electronics. And so I decided, that's something I'd like to do because it aligned well with my interests and with aviation. So that's what I did. I signed up as an aviation electronics technician.
Interesting. So you're going through this whole military process. What are your parents' reactions to you wanting to enlist in the military?
They were surprisingly okay with it. During that time, this was in the late 80s, there had been some conflict in Lebanon and Beirut at that time, but it's some, Panama, so just really more small conflicts. There wasn't really any war breaking out. So this concept that there was a danger, particularly for anyone going into the Navy, other than just occupational hazard, it wasn't really perceived as something that was super risky. So they supported it. They understood it was like a way to get job skills, job training, money for school. It seemed like a good option.
Cool. So you kind of mentioned this a little bit, and it's going to sound a little repetitive, but can you tell me what branch of the military you were interested in and why?
So I did end up going into the Navy, and I'd mentioned about flying. So I wanted to be a pilot, and the options, obviously you can fly in multiple branches. In fact, I was pretty focused on the Navy because of Top Gun, honestly. I just thought it was so cool, the whole idea of taking off and landing on aircraft carriers and the fact that you'd be mobile, in different places all the time, all the different types of airplanes that they had, aircraft in general. And so Navy was really where I wanted to go. So that's where I ended up.
Oh. So you told me how you enlisted and why you were interested in the military, but can you tell me what the recruitment and training process was? Boot camp?
Yeah. so once you decide what you're going to do, you talk to the recruiters and you actually sign the papers. And you get guaranteed a school. It's called an A school. That's your first level of training after boot camp, and you get orders to go to boot camp and go to this training. And the first thing you do is you report to the local military office called a Military Entrance Processing Station. I think MEPS is what they call it. So you report to the MEPS, and that's kind of your entry into the training process. You report there, you get sworn in, you get your orders, and then they ship you out to one of the locations where you're going to do basic training. In my case, it was actually here in San Diego. It's called Naval Training Command San Diego. And so I spent the night at MEPS near the Atlanta airport, and in the morning they shipped us out to the airport and sent us out here to San Diego to start training. It's kind of interesting now that that training command no longer exists in San Diego. So if you're familiar with where right downtown at the airport, there's Liberty Station. And Liberty Station is the old Naval Training Command. So they even still have a little boat down there. It's kind of interesting for me to go down there because I did boot camp right there. There still are a few of the barracks left down there, but it's interesting to see it all built up different and civilian than the way it was when I did training there. We'd actually get in trouble if we looked at an airplane taking off. So we were right by the end of the runway, so planes were taking off all the time. If they caught you looking or being distracted by an airplane, you'd get kind of hit with push-ups and all that kind of stuff. So interesting being back there.
Did you have any friends in the boot camp? How was like?
No, I mean, I had a
camaraderie?
bunkmate. Nobody came in with anybody they knew, not in my group. I think if they had, they would have separated them anyway. So, the first night you come in, it's all set so everyone arrives there at night. You arrive to the base, you go through this in-dock procedure, and they start separating you into companies. And that's kind of, I think anybody that knew anybody, they would separate them at that time. But yeah, I was by myself and just like everybody else.
Interesting. Were you ever deployed during your time in the military?
Never to any conflict area. So I did deployments to sea for training. So when you're in the reserves, I was in the Navy Reserves, so to be precise. I wasn't in the active Navy. So what we would do is, my unit was called a Carrier Aggregation Unit. So we were based on land at Naval Air Station Atlanta. And my group was like a holdover from the Cold War era, where there would be a threat on a carrier of a nuclear attack, a biological attack, a chemical attack, or something like this, that might wipe out the crew, the people on the boat, yet leave the boat relatively operational. So our job was to be able to have an entire group that could run a carrier, be on shore, and we could transfer to a carrier, at short notice, and be able to run the carrier. So, but after the Cold War, that threat kind of diminished. And so what we had is, during that time, you asked about deployment. So when I was in was right when Desert Shield and Desert Storm happened in the Gulf. That was when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and we sent a group in to drive them out of Kuwait and then ultimately move into Iraq. And so people from my unit were getting pulled to go to the boats that were in the Gulf. But I had, by that time, achieved a rank in my training. So I was what was called rated. When you go in the Navy, because of my ASVAB score, I went directly to training, and I got trained as an avionics technician. So they're not good. The Navy has an overall organizational structure that says we need these many aviation electronics technicians, and we need this many of this rank, this many of this rank, and so on like that. So they have a nice organizational structure, so they don't have too many leaders and not enough people doing work. So what they do is they call them billets. That's like the slots where they would put people. Well, on an active carrier, the carrier structure is all mapped out, and then they just put names into slots. So what was happening during the Gulf War was people were either getting out of the service or they were being promoted on the boat. It wasn't this case where all the people were, leaving at once. It was a very individual, slow attrition of people on the boats. So what that meant was by the time Desert Storm was happening, sorry if this is a long answer, but the people that were leaving were more senior, and the people on the boat were moving up into those slots. And so what was happening is it was the only openings that were coming up on the ship were very low-ranking, non-rated, or either very low-rated openings. Because I was already up to a E4, that's a Petty Officer 3rd class, I couldn't go into one of those slots, so they didn't pull me. What they were doing is they were pulling people from my unit. For instance, a lot of guys went in reserves to get money for college, and they just did this plan where you would go to boot camp in the summer and immediately come back to college, and you would just be an E3 seaman. That's just a basic sailor. They were pulling all the basic sailors to go to the boat and do all of the dirty work, the laundry, the kitchen, the working on the flight deck, but like just carrying chains and chipping paint and painting things, just maintenance. So they were doing the really basic low-level Navy work, and they weren't doing anything particularly technical. All those people got promoted and moved up to those jobs on the boat. So thankfully I wasn't called to do any job like that. So mostly what I did was work in the shops. We would go to either Pensacola, Florida or Jacksonville, Florida, depending on if we were going to go in the Gulf or we were going in the Atlantic. And we would go out to sea, and we were assigned to a group that supported A6 Intruders. It's a type of airplane that was on the Naval Air Station. And they would have to go and do the pilots would have to make sure they could do landings every year. They'd have to get qualified. So we would go out on the boat to support those planes while they were out. In addition to that, we'd also have to do our recurrent training for things like firefighting, damage control, and general sort of personnel training. So we had a lot of cool stuff like that we did.
It's really interesting.
One of the things about damage control that's interesting is firefighting and damage control are things that happen. Like there was a ship here in San Diego that caught fire while they were doing maintenance on it a couple of years ago, and it's practically ruined, and it was just sitting in port. Fire is really dangerous on a ship. So there's a lot of training that goes into trying to fight and prevent fires. Well, in Pensacola, they have this dedicated firefighting damage control school, and it's like its own building, and it's all piped with propane or natural gas or something, and in the inside it looks like a ship. So you go into these areas and you have these firefighting, you put on all the gear and you have hoses, and then they make the fire come into the space, and you fight the fire and use the techniques that you would use on a ship. So that was a lot of fun and pretty realistic because it's hot and it's smoky. They make it very realistic. On the damage control side, so another thing obviously that can happen on a ship is you can have a flood, have the side of the ship get damaged somehow, either accidentally or through being hit with something, and water's flooding in. And you've got to be able to patch that hole, seal those pipes, all these kinds of things. And so they had a second building that was dedicated towards that. And you would go into this simulator and pipes would start busting and water would start flowing in from the side of the ship, because in the inside it looked like a ship. And they just flooded that thing, and we had to do all of our things that we were trained to do to stop the pipe from leaking, to patch the holes in the wall. Ultimately, they would usually just let it fill up with water. So you would get to about within a couple of feet of the ceiling, and we'd have to be swimming, and then you would go out of a hatch on the top. So you did everything you could, but finally you couldn't you couldn't fight it anymore. So we would exit through a hatch on the top and then seal that compartment off. So ultimately the training was, you fought it flooded still, you escape through the next hatch and seal off from the top. It was pretty cool, very realistic. Got out all wet and everything.
That's really cool. I never heard this story before.
Yeah.
So I guess you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but can you tell me what your job was like on the aircraft carrier? Like, what was your role?
Yeah, so Avionics Electronics Technician, they're called ATs, and primarily I worked in a shop. There are 3 different levels of ATs. There's O level, I level, and depot level. So O is operational, I is intermediate, and D is depot, and it sort of goes into where the maintenance happens. I was I level, which was intermediate, so that meant I stayed in a shop on a bench, and I would work on the boxes that were coming off the airplane. So all the avionics are modular, and they can be plugged into the side of the plane and taken out. So if a radio is not working, they unplug it and they get another one. Our shop would have 2 racks, one that's like good ones, one that's like ones that need to be repaired. So the guys from O level would come down from the flight deck or from the hangar deck, get a good box, sign it out, and then they would take it and they would put that good box in the plane and check it out and send the plane on its way. And we would work on the box that got sent in on our test benches to try to figure out, could we repair that box, or do we need to then send it out to depot level? Depot was actually on shore. So shore would be a more detailed, so think of it this way, that the O-level guys, they just changed boxes. And then when you open the box, there's a bunch of cards. So I could fix down to the card level. So they pulled the box, put a new box, the plane goes on its way. Then I had a shelf full of good cards and bad cards. And I could find out which card was bad, pull that card and put it on the bad card shelf, take a new card and put it in, retest the radio, and then I could say that radio is good to go back on the shelf. And ultimately, the only things we'd have to send out usually to depot were just individual cards, not the whole radio. So that's kind of the work we did.
That's interesting.
On it was radios, flight guidance, and navigation equipment.
Cool. What was life like with like your other ATs? How did they impact your time on the ship? Are they good?
Oh, yeah. You get a full cross section of people in the service, which I think is expected. All sorts of socioeconomic, ethnic, the military is a true melting pot. So in fact, that's one of the neat things about it, is people, regardless of where they come from, you get into the mission, you get into the job, and everybody knows that you're going to do a job and they're going to do a job, and it's you're able to trust each other that you're going to do what you're supposed to, they're going to do what they're supposed to. There's always conflicts. People have conflicts just because people are human, and you have also a pretty wide range of ages as well. You have people right out of high school, inactive, and then you have people who are getting ready to all the way up into getting ready to retire. So there's a whole, mix of ages and experience and ethnicities. So there'd always be some people that you could identify with and hang out with, and have similar interests. But regardless of whether you did or you didn't, people were pretty much, knew that we were there to do a job.
Interesting. Just recently, my school went to the Midway, so we kind of got to see some of the living conditions, but can you tell me a little bit what it was like living
Yeah,
on the
I like going
aircraft?
down to the Midway actually because my ship was, so I was on two different ships, the Saratoga and the Forstall. So it's the 59 and the 60. And those ships were sort of post-Korean War, Cold War era carriers. They weren't nuclear, they were diesel powered. But, and so they're very similar in sort of construction and all of the techniques and all of the way the spaces are to the Midway. So when they go on the Midway, there's one particular spot that's, so Midway's got a lot of areas closed off that we used to go in that you can't go in on Midway, but up in the front of the ship is an area of berthing, and where we slept and lived was almost identical to what you see on the Midway up in the front. So it's bunks, just in a whole entire area full of bunks, and they're 3 high, and your locker is your bunk. And there's the restrooms are tiny. You know, the toilets are tiny, the urinals are tiny, the shower stalls are tiny. We often, didn't have hot water, and the showers would be are kind of like a push button. So you had this thing on a kind of a hose, and you just push the button, and you can get cold water. I swear, a lot of times on our boats, the water actually smelled like it had a little bit of like a diesel or a jet fuel smell to it too. But the living quarters were okay, but I preferred to spend my time at the shop even more because, our quarters ended up being where the ones on the Midway are up on the front. Ours were back on the back. The stern, bow and stern. We were right under the arresting gear. So every time the plane, so we were right under the, that's an area I don't think you can go on the Midway, but there's an area where the arresting cable mechanisms are under the deck. So those are the cables that are up on top of the flight deck that capture the airplane's landing. Well, underneath those cables connect to these giant hydraulic cylinders. So when those cables pull out, there's this really loud, obviously there's a scraping noise of the hook dragging across the deck, and you hear the jet noise because they always go to full power when they land. So it's a really noisy place to try to sleep. And those arresting gear hydraulics would make a squeal. And then after they did that, then they'd have to rewind it, and it would make a noise when it rewound too. So it was a noisy place to stay. But I ended up preferring to be in the shop. And then, when we would go to sea, you'd end up being on 12 hours or sometimes 16-hour shifts. My ship didn't ever go to 16, but you go on like 12 hours shifts. And because there wasn't anything really else to do, you're either sleeping or going and doing your job. So, hanging around in the berthing areas wasn't really desirable anyway.
So you talked a little bit about planes landing on the ship, and I know you got to work with them a lot. What type of aircrafts did you get to see or work with?
Yeah, so keep in mind it was back in the 80s. So this was 80s, early 90s. And so we had planes like, you can look these up, but they're A7 Corsairs, A6 Intruders, EA6Bs, which is like an electronic, they still fly those actually. This is like an electronic jammer version of the A6s, F-14s, S3 Vikings. These are like the anti-sub jets, all the helicopters. We had on the base, we actually supported Marines too. So we supported the AH-1, the Cobras, and OV-10 Broncos. Those are like close air support aircraft. We even had a C9 on the base, which is basically a DC-9. It's an old, sort of like a commercial plane, but it was all outfitted for the Navy. So F-18s. Let's see. would get to C2, so there'd be planes that would come in and deliver supplies and mail and things like that to the ship. That's called a C2, so it's sort of like the cargo plane that would land on the ship. And then, of course, there were the trainers. So sometimes when we would go out, particularly in the Gulf, new pilots for the Navy train in Pensacola, and part of their training would be they'd have to land on a ship. So we would go out and we would be like the target for them to land. And they were flying A4s, Skyhawks. This is like a Vietnam era single seat jet. And more recently, they're flying something called a T-34, I think, a Ghost Hawk. But yeah, those were the trainers. So all kinds of different airplanes, really.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what the flight operations were like on the aircraft carrier?
Yeah. So that was one thing. So when we would go, it would be constant flight ops, so that was the cool thing about it. Even though we weren't going into a conflict zone, our mission was to do flight ops. So it was constant flight ops. And so I didn't get to go out on the deck. So remember, I was eye level.
Mm-hmm.
So eye level guys works in the shops, but occasionally we would go with one of the O level guys up onto the deck and either to help them with a plane or just to be able to observe for training purposes what they were doing and how it worked. And being up there on the deck while flight ops is going on is really impressive, because the ship always turns into the wind. So one thing is, like, it immediately gets super windy because the ship is going as fast as it can, and then it goes into the wind. So the pilots have as much wind as they can get from natural wind plus the speed of the boat, and then you get the jet exhaust. It's very chaotic. There's a lot of stuff going on, but it's very there's a lot of action. And the smell was pretty cool because I like jet fuel smell, and it's just constant jet fuel smell going down the deck because you're always downwind because there's only planes up in front of you, and it's hot because you get the afterburners and everything like that. So when they have these things called jet blast deflectors. So when the planes are getting ready to take off, they raise these jet blast deflectors, and they will then they will go to afterburner, and the afterburners will be blowing into this, but you still get all the hot air and everything behind it. In fact, the jet blast deflectors are really cool because it's just a piece of deck. There's 3 pieces of deck that rises up behind the airplane, and they're cooled. They have pipes going through there. They're liquid cooled, so they have seawater running through there to keep that metal cool. So when the next plane rides over, it doesn't melt the tires or melt your shoe when you walk on it or something like that. So it's kept cool by seawater because it has that afterburner of every jet, one after the other, like blowing on it. So it's pretty neat. So you've got all of that going on, and it's just a really cool place to see. And you've got the planes landing too. So there's depending on the carrier, they can launch from the nose or they can launch from the waist, and sometimes they can be simultaneously landing and launching. So there could be landings going on at the same time as they're launching. So that's pretty neat. Yeah.
I don't know if you want to talk about this, but were you ever involved in any emergency situations on the aircraft carrier?
Thankfully, no. So that's an easy one. Never had a problem. The one thing I can say is that the carrier I was on was a carrier called the Forstall, which was involved in probably one of the biggest naval accidents, during the Vietnam War. I wasn't going to say ever, but probably not ever, but definitely during the Vietnam War. And I think it's still used as a training example today of, how to fight fires, how to do damage control, because there were lots of mistakes made during that episode. that almost sank the ship and got a lot of people killed because they were not doing things properly. So there's a lot of film of it, of the episode, and you can see, hindsight, you can see the things that they're doing wrong. So it's pretty interesting.
When you were out at sea, what did you miss most about home?
I wasn't ever out to sea for long periods of time, but definitely the racks were not, that's what we called our bunks, the racks were not the best. So the living conditions, being in your own bed is nice, or even being in barracks on shore is nice. But so living conditions, the food was okay, but fast food and that kind of thing was nice to miss. Yeah, mostly I would say it was the living conditions and family and friends and maybe some hamburgers and stuff.
Nothing's changed. Did your experience on the aircraft carrier impact any other aspects of your life?
On the aircraft carrier, well, I'll skip ahead a little bit and say Navy in general. Just the, I really have taken a lot of what I learned during basic all the way through A school and everything. They started in basic training. They would do this mantra of attention to detail. So they didn't want you looking at airplanes. They didn't want you doing anything that you weren't supposed to be doing. So they would say attention to detail. And so if you accept that and start trying to apply that to whatever you do, it becomes a way of life, and you notice little things, and sometimes that can make a big difference. So kind of live my life according to that, call it a mantra, but it's just, paying attention, slow down enough to, make sure that you're doing everything the way you're supposed to. Also, the order, there's a certain amount of order. So, yeah, that's good.
That's right. Is there anything else you would like to share with me?
No, you've done a good job of asking questions. I was in during Desert Storm, Desert Shield. For that, for those deployments I did during that time, and for being active reserves, I got Meritorious Service Medal. I had good conduct. I was also a sharpshooter, so I had sharpshooter ribbon. Let's see, what else did I do in there? In general, despite that stuff, I mean, it's fed into my career. It fed into me going into college. I eventually did fly. I became a flight instructor. So kind of all of that. I got a job at Delta Airlines when I went back to Atlanta. And it's sort of shocking that the structure of Delta Airlines Aviation Maintenance Organization mirrors almost identically that of the Navy, the way they handle shops, the way they number things. So it was very easy to transition from the military into Delta. And I think that's that structure and the way they do things is like tried and true. That's kind of the way that works. But I'd recommend it to anyone that's considering a military career. You don't have to be a frontline soldier. You don't have to be out at sea even if you're going to be in the Navy. They have practically every career field you can think of. There's a spot for it in the Navy. You can get good training. You can get good experience. You could even make an entire career out of it if you wanted to. I sometimes wished maybe that I had gone in. You choose your path in life, but I just was trying to go the pilot route, so I needed to get out and get that degree. But I know a lot of guys that stayed in, and it's funny. So I went in basically when I was 18. You can do 20 years in the military and retire. I would have been 38 and been able to have a whole second career and a military retirement. But, you know, in between, that's a hard life, but you never know. Some people that would suit them and their goals. So I wouldn't discourage anyone from checking out the military, in particular the Navy, to see if there's a career field. My dentist actually was trained in the Air Force, so.
That's pretty cool. Well, thank you for joining me, Brian. It was nice talking to you.
Yeah, thank you for interviewing. Good luck.